I do not believe that this was a justified use of deadly force.
Don't shoot! Don't hate me because I'm black!
Americans want law and order. They demand law and order.
Another police shooting of an unarmed black man as protesters' demands for police accountability grow. Can Congress deliver substantive reform? And will President Trump's first campaign rally in over 3 months to shore up his base stoke racial tensions? Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. The police shooting of Rayshard Brooks, a 27-year-old black man shot in the back by a white police officer in Atlanta on the 12th of June, has fueled a new wave of protest over police brutality and racial injustice in the United States. Responding to growing pressures from protesters and lawmakers calling for systemic reforms, President Trump signed an executive order on policing.
Today is about pursuing common sense and fighting for a cause like we seldom get the chance to fight for. We have to find common ground. But I strongly oppose the radical and dangerous efforts to defend, dismantle, and dissolve our police departments, especially now when we've achieved the lowest recorded crime rates in recent history. Americans know the truth. Without police, there is chaos. Without law, there is anarchy. And without safety, there is catastrophe.
Meanwhile, Congress is working on police reform legislation, with Republicans drafting a new bill in response to the Democrats' far-reaching proposals, including an end to qualified immunity for police officers who, quote, recklessly violate civil rights, and the establishment of a national registry for police misconduct. This while protesters' calls to defund the police and divert the spending to benefit social services programs continue to echo across U.S. cities. So will ambitious and overdue policing reforms be accepted by President Trump and the Republican-dominated Senate? And will the new laws satisfy protesters and curb police violence? Let's go in depth with one of the Democrats behind the Policing Act of 2020, Congresswoman Bernice Johnson from Texas, a state with a Republican governor. Congresswoman Bernice Johnson, does the president's executive order, which now bans chokeholds unless the police officer's life is at risk, does it go far enough in addressing the issue of police brutality and changing the policing culture here in the U.S.?
No, I do not believe that it does. I think that it's going to take more training in the academies. The one good thing is that it does show that the president must be listening, because he's tracked some of these measures after some of the legislation that has been introduced and sponsored by the Congressional Caucus, but it does not go far enough. And we are really pushing for much more training in the police academies. This is a long-time systemic practice of police across this country.
A lot of people now have been talking about the crime bill of 1994, which you supported and which led to this new policing culture of harsh treatment of suspects, of mass incarceration. In fact, many of the bill's critics will say that it has undercut the efforts underway now for reform. Do you agree?
No, I do not agree with all of the measures. During that period, there was a massive crack cocaine culture that was an effort to try to put some controls there. But this issue that we are talking about now is not tied to any particular effort of cocaine or drug trafficking that we were dealing with then. This is a historic behavior of white policemen versus African American or Hispanic persons over the years.
But the critics, though, say that we need to look at the legacy of that crime bill, Congresswoman. The bill provided funding for an additional 100,000 new police officers. It also provided at the time $9 billion in funding for prisons. This is what you said at the time.
We must fund the additional police. You know, I used to fear policemen before I got to know who they really were. Now I would not live in a neighborhood, on a block, that I didn't feel had some attention from the police. The money that will help put the additional cops on the streets, an almost 20% increase in the nation's 504,000 local police officers, will go a long ways in addressing this area. I cannot understand why there is so much opposition and so much rhetoric and so much demagoguery surrounding the bill that will address these issues.
You said this more than 25 years ago, but
And I
do
would
you
say
still
the same
feel
thing
this way?
today. I still feel the same way. I just feel that the policemen need to be better trained. Out of that bill came community policing. It made all the difference in the world for people to know the policemen, to feel that they were their friends in the community. But policemen now live out of the city from where they work. None of them live in the communities or even the city limits for the most part of where they work. And so they don't know each other. We had a real crime wave with drugs back during that time. And if we had that same crime wave now, I would support the same bill again because there were many positives in that bill.
What a lot of people are calling for is accountability. Can there be accountability if police officers are still protected by powerful unions and if they are still shielded from prosecution?
There will be no accountability without better training, and there will be no accountability where there is not some controls on how the unions or whatever body, because all these police associations have one thing in mind, and that is only protecting the policemen. We want an attitude where there are rules that govern on both sides. You cannot protect policemen when you know there are some who should be weeded out of the police departments. I think that the better educated they are and the better education they have and working and respecting people is what will make the difference. When you have a policeman who can commit a crime in one place and go to a suburban area, another place and get a job, that should be ruled out. And I do believe.
But does that mean though, Congresswoman, forgive me for interrupting, does it mean that there is a systemic problem that needs to be addressed? Because President Trump has said more than on one occasion in the last few days that 99% of police officers are, quote, great people. He obviously doesn't seem to believe that there is a systemic policing problem.
Well, anyone who is familiar with the United States knows there's a systemic racist problem here. And this is all a part of it. The attitude has been that as long as the skin is black, it's okay to kill. That's what we need to change. We need to change that systemic racist attitude. There's no place for it. Slavery has been over a long time, and that's where we will be fighting to make sure that rules will govern that kind of behavior because of the color of the skin of the persons of which they're trying to patrol.
Congresswoman Bernice Johnson, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, the nationwide protests triggered by the police killing of George Floyd have refocused attention on the Black Lives Matter movement. 2/3 of American adults now say they support the movement, which became nationally recognized 6 years ago after another case of police brutality in Ferguson, Missouri. Today, 84% of Americans say peaceful protests across the U.S. are justified, compared to 67% in 2016. And now 76% say they consider racism and discrimination a big problem, up from 51% in 2015. So is this a moment of reckoning for America? Let's put this issue in focus with DeRay Mckesson. He was a key activist behind the Black Lives Matter protests in Ferguson in 2014 and Baltimore in 2015, and he is a leading voice for the movement. He also co-founded Campaign Zero, a police reform organization. DeRay Mckesson, when you compare the current national mood, when you compare the extraordinary momentum that is behind the Black Lives Movement today, how does it compare to previous year? How different is this moment?
Yeah, so I don't think about this in terms of comparison. I think about what it means that this is a long line and tradition of resistance about similar issues. So when we were in the street in 2014, it was because the police had killed a young Black man. When we are in the street again, we're in the street because the police have killed another Black man. The police have killed Breonna Taylor. The police are killing Black women. They're killing Black children, right? Like that is what is causing people to be in the street. We think about what does it mean that a third of all the people killed by a stranger in the United States is actually killed by a police officer. In 2019 was the first year ever where Black people were more afraid of being killed by an officer than being killed by community violence. So we take all of those together and say this is actually a tradition of resistance. What is unique about this moment is that there are even more people in the street. In 2014, people were waking up. In 2020, people are awake now to the problem, laser focused on what solutions will look like.
But as you say, there's a whole history of police brutality. In fact, it's something that Black people in America have endured for decades. How much of this extraordinary outpouring of support on the streets of America, around the world as well, have to do with the fact that African Americans seem to be caught in the midst of the three major crises that the United States is facing today? Not just police brutality and racism, which many are now seeing as endemic and systemic, but also the pandemic and the economic downturn, all of which have disproportionately affected the community.
Yeah, I think it is a combination. I never want to lose sight of the fact that it is the police consistently over history that have gotten people in the streets. Stonewall was a riot. We think about Watts. We think about most of the uprising in cities that were all triggered by some sort of violence of the police. And that's not insignificant because when we think about the police, you know, people sometimes would say to me, why do you focus so much on the police? Why don't you talk about prisons and jails? Why don't you focus on bigger issues in mass incarceration? And what I tell them is name all the ways you get to prison or jail that don't include a police officer.
So police brutality for you is key here, but you have said in the past that we deserve a world where Black people are safe, and we know that that cannot happen until we move beyond policing. How will you use this moment, this momentum? Today, the Black Lives Matter movement is more popular than the Democratic Party, more popular than the Republican Party, more popular than both presidential candidates. How will you use this moment to enact real, lasting change?
Yeah, that's the question, right? So I think that there are a lot of things happening. I think that there's a focus to move the money away from policing and move it to community-based supports. And that is a simple idea, right? We believe that experts should do what experts do. And who should respond to a mental health crisis? Probably an expert in mental health, probably not a police officer, somebody with a gun. Who should respond to homelessness? Not a police officer, somebody with a gun, right? So we should move those responsibilities and move that money. And as long as there are any police officers, as long as there are any people with guns, they should have significantly less power than they have today. So that means ending things like qualified immunity from the Supreme Court. It means changing police union contracts. It means changing policies. That this is a both and set of strategies, not an either or set of strategies.
How confident are you, though, that the political system will move beyond just mere slogans, that they will go beyond just banning chokeholds or putting together a national registry for police offenders, that this will actually go to a place and meet the demands on the streets?
I'm confident. You know, I think that there's a moment. I've been in so many conversations with mayors and people across the country looking for policy changes. I think they're hungry. They want to know what to do. I think the reality is a lot of mayors, a lot of people in general don't know much of the data about policing, don't know much of the policy solutions, but people are learning and demanding as they should be. And that's actually really powerful. You know, people are pushing for community-based alternatives. I think that people understand the accountability, and we're trying to lift those things up as much as possible. So a lot of people didn't know before we launched A Can't Wait that only 28 of the 100 largest cities in America actually ban chokeholds. People thought that like they were banned everywhere. They're not, right? People didn't know that in most cities it's permissible to shoot into a moving vehicle. So there are all these things that people just like thought because they're so common sense, even though they're not commonplace. Like people thought they just were a part of the practice, and like they weren't. So I think that we see that people are now starting to pay attention to police unions and how, you know, you think about Minneapolis, how 50% of the officers who were fired got rehired. But that's like a feature of the system. That's not like a bug of the system. So I think that people get it. You know, I think that this opens up space to do so much in a really aggressive way that I'm excited about.
DeRay Mckesson, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, good to be here.
President Trump is facing multiple crises: the ongoing protests, a pandemic which has cost the lives of more than 115,000 people, growing unemployment, and more recently, a growing chorus of criticism from within the Republican Party and among the country's top military brass. The president's approval ratings have continued to slide to about 42%, according to some of the latest polls, and he has dropped 8 points behind his presidential rival, former Vice President Joe Biden. In an attempt to energize his base, President Trump will hold his first rally since the pandemic began in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where 99 years ago, hundreds of Black Americans were killed by white mobs and the National Guard using aerial bombings to raze an entire affluent African-American neighborhood to the ground. Under mounting pressure, Trump postponed his rally by 1 day to avoid holding it on the 19th of June, a date known as Juneteenth, which commemorates the end of slavery. So will this rally help President Trump galvanize his supporters? Joining me now is Michael Steele, former chairman of the Republican National Committee and former lieutenant governor of Maryland. Michael Steele, why would President Trump choose Tulsa, Oklahoma at a politically and racially charged moment like this, with all of its symbolism, to hold his first rally in many months?
I think that the answer to that question is lost on a lot of folks right now in terms of, what's going on in the country, and then to sort of come together around two very important facts. One is Juneteenth, the day that slavery officially ended, when the words of the Emancipation Proclamation finally reached the farthest territories of the United States. And two, the history of Tulsa, the white mobs that attacked African American citizens, and what that meant at the time, particularly given the efforts that were being made in terms of Black wealth creation and creating community post-slavery.
But the president must have known all of this. He must have known about the date and the location before picking it. I mean, was it just a sheer coincidence, a mistake on his part, on the part of his advisors, or was there something more to it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that he must have known. The fact of the matter is, I know how these things typically play themselves out. The president wants to do a rally. Oklahoma is one of the reddest states in the country. Juneteenth has been in the news recently, so it's an opportunity to sort of maximize, or at least capitalize, on connections to African Americans. So you start putting those dots together. The historic impact and nature of it all is lost because there's no African Americans in the room giving the president and his team the history lesson of why this would not be the best thing to do.
But it's also a state that he won easily last time, I think by some 36 points. So why would he not have chosen a swing state?
He's going back to his base. So I'm not going to sit there and pretend that, that this was, discussed and the history of it was laid out. I think this was a political calculation, pure and simple. And now they're dealing with the ramifications of that calculation. It turns out it was a miscalculation.
Well, you say he's going back to his base. Senator Kamala Harris goes further. In fact, she tweeted this. She said, "This isn't just a wink to white supremacists. He's throwing them a welcome home party." Has the Republican Party, which after all was established in the mid-1850s to put an end to slavery, has it now become a refuge for white supremacists?
Oh, it has. It has been a refuge since about 1968, when President Nixon, in his election strategy, created what we know as the Southern strategy, which pulled into the party the white supremacists, KKK members, white men who were disapproving of Lyndon Johnson's embrace of civil rights. The irony of it is that we were very much advocates for those very same civil rights, but then politics took hold, and we are now, some 50-some years later, reaping the sour, dreadful benefits of embracing white nationalism.
Folks, you were the first African-American leader of the Republican National Party. You've seen how in the last week or two, several prominent Republicans, including General Colin Powell and others, have come out to say that they will in fact cross party lines in November and actually vote for a Democrat, for Joe Biden. As a former leader of the party, would you urge voters in November to vote their party or their conscience?
I think they need to vote their conscience. I mean, I've always advocated that, whether it was George Bush on the ballot or Donald Trump or Barack Obama. I've always advocated that because that's what our Constitution allows us to do. We're not beholden, unless we want to be, to a political party or a political structure. So you have the freedom, and I think you see now amongst many Americans a desire to exercise that franchise, that ability to vote openly and freely and fairly in November. So I think you're going to see that play itself out.
What would be the best thing that could actually happen to the Republican Party in November? Would it be a resounding loss for Donald Trump and the Republicans? Would it force them then to rethink and reinvent the party that has frankly moved away from its original values and has left a lot of minorities outside of the political fold?
Well, that's a tough question to answer because we don't know what the Republican Party is or will be in November. It is clearly Trumpified at the moment. Should the country decide to move away from Trump and vote him out, then there's going to be a recalibration, a rebooting of what Republican versus conservatism is. So it's hard to see or to say exactly how that plays itself out. What I think the party needs to recognize is it's not just Donald Trump on the ballot in November. It's also all the down ballot candidates from the U.S. Senate, governor's races, all the way down to dog catcher.
And at the same time, Democrats are openly voicing their concerns that Trump could steal the elections in November. This is what Joe Biden said.
My greatest concern, my single greatest concern, this president's going to try to steal this election. This is a guy who said that all mail-in ballots are fraudulent. Voting by mail, while he sits behind the desk in the Oval Office and writes his mail-in ballot to vote in the primary.
Do many Republicans, at least privately, share Biden's concerns that this president could steal the election or delegitimize the process with which people are going to vote in November?
Yeah, I think it's less stealing. That's hard to do, the way our electoral system is set up. We saw even from the Russian interference in 2016 that the idea of stealing is a tougher nut to crack, but certainly impacting the election, disinformation, those types of strategies certainly can have an impact on an election. And I think the bigger concern is taking the ideas around, vote by mail, saying that they're fraudulent or somehow that's cheating. Well, the president cheated if that's his standard because he just voted by mail, as Joe Biden mentioned. So if it's good enough for the president to cast his ballot by mail, it's good enough for every American to do the same thing in November. But safeguarding that process is very, very important.
But isn't the reality, though, that allowing voting by mail, which is what the Democrats want to do, does not play in the hands of Republicans because it would allow more minorities, including a lot of African-American voters, to participate?
Stop it.
That isn't going to help the Republicans,
More
though, is it?
minorities don't get to vote just because there's vote by mail. Every citizen will have an equal opportunity to access the ballot. If they want a ballot, they make the request, a ballot is sent to them. So the reality of it is the statistics show that more Americans vote. Yes, minorities, but white folks too. Everybody votes more when the access to that ballot is easier to obtain. So allowing that to happen is a good thing, not a bad thing. It doesn't question the process. It actually enhances the process.
But do you agree with those who believe that the more people vote, the less the Republicans' chances are in November? This is what the president himself said. This is what the president himself said in March about the Democrats' push for more vote by mail. He said they had levels of voting that if you ever agreed to, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
Well, you have to ask yourself why. Come on, stop it. That's just crazy. You don't know how people will vote. If I make a good case to the American people, if I make a good argument for my election or re-election, if I make a good argument for my policies, if they want to support them, they will.
All right. Michael Steele, former chairman of the Republican National Committee, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, as always.
Now, of course, each presidential election is a defining moment for a nation. But the ballots Americans will or will not cast by November 3rd may well be an inflection point for the United States, no matter who wins. A moment of reckoning, of soul-searching, not just for race relations in America, which have fluctuated between latent and overt discrimination, but also for the two major political parties driven further apart since the traumatic era of McCarthyism in the early 50s, when Americans saw enemies within. The schism is possibly more about rural versus urban America than it may be communal, ethnic in nature. But in the end, it begs the question whether American democracy, its complex federal electoral system, which is not based on one person, one vote, has not simply become anachronistic. The key to this election is, as it has always been, voter participation, which was around 55% for the last two presidential contests. And so, in short, African Americans, disproportionate victims of the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic fallout, have been galvanized since the murder of George Floyd. But not only them, emotions are running high throughout the country and are likely to ensure high voter turnout believed to favor the Democratic candidate. Trump's divisive language and tactics are not only energizing his base, ironically, they're also boosting his challenger, Joe Biden. Let us know what you think. Send us your thoughts and comments. But for now, from me and the team here in Washington, thanks for watching.